My name is Tim Attwood. I'm the Secretary of the John and Pat Hume Foundation. And on behalf of the Hume family and the Hume Foundation, we're delighted to host the third event in honour of Seamus Mallon. The first event, actually, we had a panel a year after Seamus passed away on Zoom, and a number of the people here were on it. The one person who's missing from that Zoom is Lord Trimble. And Seamus and David had an interesting relationship, Orla, I would say, but at the end they were very close. And I know in the weeks before Seamus passed, David Trimble visited the Mallon house and they had some wonderful conversations. So obviously it's important to remember we've lost Lord Trimble since that event. The second event we had for Seamus was, obviously policing was so important, was Lord Chris Patton, which was on Zoom. And then last year we had a wonderful lecture by Sir Hugh Ord. And I know there's some members of the policing board in the audience who may get questioned and grilled about the policing problems at the moment, because Seamus always believed if you didn't sort out policing, you didn't sort out the trouble. So I'm sure that will be. So we're delighted that in person we have a really strong group of friends, family and colleagues who worked with Seamus, debated with Seamus, challenged Seamus, and Seamus challenged them over many, many decades of the courageous leadership of Seamus Mallon. It's an honour for me to welcome you. I'm going to pass to Sean O'Rourke, our excellent chair for the evening, and I'm sure he'll put some of the guests under pressure, as Seamus was a great sportsman and he liked to put people under pressure. He might have bitten a few of your ankles over the years as well, or kicked them underneath the table as well. So thank you for coming, and thank you, Sean O'Rourke.
Yeah. Tim, thank you so much. And just your reference to Seamus and sport, I was trawling through his book. It's a wonderful book, bears reading and rereading over again and again. But he refers to his very good friend Eugene Reevy, who is a giant really in the history of this area. But he said Eugene, he liked nothing better than a good scrap on a football field. But we're not in a football field. We're here on this platform. And I thought maybe before we get into our proceedings, it might be no harm to remind ourselves of Seamus Mallon himself.
After he was told he had cancer late last year, Seamus Mallon was keen to spend his final days in Market Hill, County Armagh. He had once talked about the importance of home place in a documentary.
This is a small community, under siege at times. It's a place worth preserving. Many have left it because of the pressures and the dangers that exist here. But if I did nothing else in my time in politics, at least I can say that I stayed with the people that I was reared among, that I give them some cause to hope for the future, and stayed with them to the last.
His father was a local primary school teacher. His mother, Jane O'Flaherty, was originally from County Donegal. 3 of her brothers were involved in the anti-treaty side from 1916 and died young. She didn't hide her disillusionment about armed struggle. He became involved in the civil rights movement and the SDLP in the late 1960s. His wife Gertrude was a nurse and the breadwinner, while Seamus, a trained teacher, was a busy but unpaid political activist. His antipathy towards violence was shaped by personal experience, like the moments spent with 2 fatally injured RUC men in Market Hill.
Big guy Snowden Corky, whom I have known for years, a friend of mine, another young lad from Armagh. They had tried to get some protection. I'd rolled under a cattle truck. I was kneeling under the cattle truck. And he said to me, Shimmy, tell them all I love them. Went to both their funerals. And it's not hard to realise how damaged the psyche of the Unionist community was.
He thought the Sunningdale Agreement offered Northern Ireland a way out of conflict and was crestfallen when the Brian Faulkner-led power-sharing administration collapsed in 1974. He would call the Good Friday Agreement that followed 24 years later the Sunningdale for slow learners. In 1986, he won the Newry and Armagh Westminster seat from the Ulster Unionist MP Jim Nicholson. He would hold it until his retirement in 2005.
Seamus Mallon.
Never again will people representing the nationalist community come in the tradesman's entrance.
As the SDLP spokesperson on security, he was fearless in confronting violence from every quarter, the state included.
Seamus was not afraid to speak out against everyone who was doing wrong. And he was fearless, and he lived in a very difficult area. He lived in the heart of a loyalist area, really, of a unionist area. He never moved out of it. He never thought of moving out of it. But he was a straight talker. He said what he knew to be right, and he never flinched.
He knew the 1990s talks undertaken by SDLP leader John Hume with Sinn Féin's Gerry Adams were important, but he worried that his party would pay a high price.
We handed the baton on to them in many ways, as it turned out. It was a big sacrifice to make and not be reciprocated.
After the Good Friday Agreement, as Deputy First Minister, he led a power-sharing administration with First Minister David Trimble.
There was, to begin with, quite a bit of tension between Unionists and Nationalists, but as we got further into the detail of it, that changed. And we developed a relationship, and developed a good relationship. There was times when we didn't agree, but that's natural in politics. And as I said, Seamus had not much time for people who weren't prepared to put the effort in, who weren't prepared to make progress.
Significant periods of his retirement were spent with his wife Gertrude until her death in 2016. 2018 was a golden year for him. He attended a Queen's University event to mark the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. He was given the freedom of Drogheda. With journalist Andy Pollock and former diplomat Tim O'Connor, he worked on what would be a very successful autobiography. He spoke at a rally supporting a second presidential term for Michael D. Higgins. At an event in Dublin to honour all the victims of the Troubles, he showed his optimism still burned bright.
We have got an agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. Some people say it has been damaged, that it's finished. It's not. It hasn't yet really begun. And I would make a plea that we all, instead of talking about an end to it, that we look upon it as a new beginning.
Seamus Mallon did indeed live to see a revival of the SDLP and the middle ground. In his final days, when the new generation of SDLP leaders went to see him, he gave them his views. They had the good sense to take notes.
And that was my friend and colleague and our former Northern editor in RT, Tommy Gorman. That was his obituary when Seamus died. And he really comes through very powerfully there, as always he did, Seamus, no matter what the platform, even towards the end of his life. A shared home place, the name of his memoir, the title, it's our theme as well for this evening's discussion, in which our two panels will examine the current political state of Northern Ireland from their different perspectives. How do we make it function better? Or, as the invitation to this evening's event puts it, we're going to engage in a positive, inclusive and challenging conversation about people, peace and politics for the next 25 years. The kind of people who we saw on our way in here, heading to that Deb's ball here in the Canal Court Hotel. I mean, it's their future we're talking about as much as our own. I'd like to say at the outset how honoured I am to be your moderator this evening. When I became political correspondent of the Irish Press in January of 1984, the New Ireland Forum was in session, and Seamus Mallon was a key participant and a trenchant contributor. He was, I think it's true to say, seen as closer to Fianna Fáil than others in the SDLP delegation at that time. He certainly was supportive of Charlie Haughey's emphasis on a unitary state as the Irish state as the preferred solution that the Forum would wish to see. Fianna Fáil were more than a little taken aback just over a year later when Seamus gave his wholehearted support to the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, giving the Irish government an input into the governance of Northern Ireland. Fianna Fáil had put him into the Seanad, albeit very briefly, in 1982. And Seamus also had had a run-in, I think, with Gareth Fitzgerald over a bunging incident in the house of his friend Mackie Moyna. Fianna Fáil, I think, kind of saw him as their man. They learned, I think, like a lot of others, that Seamus Mallon was never anybody but his own man. Be that as it may, I covered the January by-elections that followed the resignation of unionist politicians and spent a day on the campaign with Seamus. God, it was cold that January. But the hospitality was warm, with Gertrude making me a bacon butty before we headed off, or maybe it was when we came back. I think, Orla, you might have been there in your school uniform at that stage. But in any event, Seamus, it was a big turning point in his career because he was elected to Westminster in those by-elections, and he showed himself to be the consummate politician for the best part of 2 decades, and an awful lot of things flowed from it, not least the Good Friday Agreement and the institutions where he was Deputy First Minister. Our speakers this evening in our first panel, Enda Kenny, former Fine Gael politician, served, of course, as Taoiseach from 2011 to 2017, leader of the Fine Gael party from 2002 to 2017, elected to the Dáil at the age of 24, a close friend of Seamus Mallon's. I think you described him earlier on this evening, Enda, as somebody who was almost like an uncle to you. And also we have Sharon Haughey, who described Seamus as a mentor, and she was somebody who came to prominence first when she wrote to Bill Clinton as a young person, and she quoted the words of the then 14-year-old Sharon, who wrote to him about her hopes and vision. And then Sharon went on to become a councillor, and indeed, having spoken in the presence of President Clinton to a worldwide audience, she then became a councillor for Armagh City and was appointed Lord Mayor in 2012. Also here we have Dermot Ahern, former Minister for Foreign Affairs, former Minister for Justice, representative of a border constituency of County Louth, served in that Bertie Ahern government from start to finish. And we have Tim O'Connor, the consummate diplomat who was working on Anglo-Irish relations from, I think, about 1986 onwards, Tim, and until 2016, and in fact still makes a contribution as a member of the monitoring committee. He'll tell us himself what it monitors, and also great to be joined as well by Ian James Marshall, OBE, a farmer and former member of the Ulster Unionist Party, the UUP, a neighbour of Seamus in Market Hill, and also a member of the Seanad there, and elected to the Seanad in 2018, lost his seat in 2020 in the general election, and unfortunately for him, didn't get it back when there were by-elections. I think there was a bit of a carve-up went on between the two main parties, which squeezed him out. In any event, I suppose just to start with a general question, maybe starting with yourself, Orla. And again, we're trying to read the mind of somebody from beyond the grave. What do you think your dad would make of the situation in Northern Ireland now?
Oh gosh, sure. That's
an easy one to start.
That's a really easy question to start with. I think he would be despairing in many ways, and extremely frustrated. I think first, there's so many reasons why Northern Ireland needs to get back on track, and Stormont needs to operate. And I think he would be so frustrated. I think you could see him making a return to politics if he were able to. He really, he would be, definitely. Very, yeah.
But he described himself in the book, I think, as a realistic pragmatist as well. And I suppose he would be looking for ways to get through the impasse that's there. But it really, we seem to be stuck at the moment.
Absolutely. And stuck in a bit of a quagmire. I think, yeah, Dad was very much, for taking the bull by its horns and trying to move things on. And, we're not going to move on unless people are around the table.
Yeah.
And that's very much...
Enda Kenny, you were Taoiseach in 2016 when that historic vote, the Brexit vote, happened in June of 2016. You had the foresight to ensure that in the aftermath of it, whatever happened, that in the event of Ireland achieving a unity of some form, that Northern Ireland would, as of right, become part of the European Union. But we're 7 years on now from that Brexit vote. Did you ever think in your sort of greatest fears that things would be as grim as they are from a political point of view?
Well, I wish that Seamus Mallon were here. We could do with him now. I first met I was elected in 1975. Seamus became an MP afterwards in 79. We met them in the New Ireland Forum in 84. They were sort of looked up to, in the sense, and rightly so, because of the appearances on television, unfortunately, following the civil rights movement and all of that. But I really liked Seamus Mallon for a number of reasons. First of all, on the day of his funeral, I went to the school. I parked my car behind the school and looked in the window, because I was through the same training myself. And when it doesn't teach you everything, it does teach you to listen to voices around you. And I pictured Seamus Mallon in that classroom, because history and geography determine a great deal of our character and our personality. And there he was, a young man, following on from his father, teaching the kids. What was he teaching them? He was teaching them during the realities of life, which he described very well, Sean, in speaking about his book, that this was a case of people having lived together for centuries, as he put it, cheek by jowl. And because of the situation with the monarchy and later British governments, that these people were at each other's throats. And it wasn't just about the stench of death, he said, it's about the moral decay in the society. And I could see him looking out that window of that school and saying, what am I going to teach these youngsters who grew up to be young Debs and whatever they are now? And Seamus had those attributes of an ability to listen and therefore think, but also he could be as obstinate as anybody you ever met. And having played full back for Armagh and being a fierce member of the GAA, I can understand how he brought those characteristics into politics. And he was not afraid to take it, and by Jesus, he could give it when he wanted. So I think for him, he set out the challenge for Northern Ireland in that book when he said to the Unionists, the Nationalists were disgracefully treated by British governments. The Unionists have been shabbily treated by British governments, and he said, and will continue to do so. And after his death, they were. And he said, come work with us, because everybody's going to be here, or their descendants, for the next 100 and 200 years to live, as he put it, cheek by jowl. So he was a practical constitutionalist, a nationalist who wanted unity of this island by peaceful means and no death. I'll just finish this comment on this. I was saying to Dermot, at the early House Convention in south of Washington in 84, after the New Ireland Forum, or 85, Seamus Mallon got up in the middle of the assembled public representatives who were there from the Tory party, the Labour Party, the Independent, the Liberal Party, all of the Northern Ireland parties, with one exception, all of the parties from the Republic. And Seamus Mallon said, who is missing from this gathering? And he said, I'll tell you. He said, Sinn Féin are missing. And who are they? He said, when I look down from where I live in Market Hill, they're my neighbours. I've lived here all my life. They're the people whom I pull out of the drain with the tractor, or they pull me out of the drain with the tractor, and they're the same people who, by virtue of circumstance and history, were put at each other's throat, where the stench and the smell of death harboured that moral decay that he spoke of. And he set that challenge to everybody. Come work with us, remove all these things, and live as we could live and as we should be able to do so. That's the Seamus Mallon I knew and loved as a politician.
Dermot Ahern, that was powerful contribution. And policing and security were subjects, and there were themes that dominated Seamus's thinking and his activity, being spokesperson on justice for the SDLP for many years. And policing and policing reform were key elements of the Good Friday Agreement. That seems to be something that's fraying or has become frayed at the edges in a big way, aside and separate from the Brexit situation at the moment.
Yeah, well, I lived very close to Seamus, and not only did I live close to him, but I was very politically close to him. As you said, he was associated with Fianna Fáil, and for me, the type of philosophy, as Enda indicated, spoke for how I felt about the situation on the island. Seamus drummed into me the issue of policing when we were in discussions not only during the Good Friday Agreement but also the St Andrews Agreement. And if you remember, after the St Andrews Agreement, the policing issue was, to a certain extent, solved. I'd say he'd be very disappointed today the way things have happened, not just in the political sphere, the fact that the institutions aren't up and running. I would think that he would be extremely disappointed with the way in which Brexit has unfolded, in the way that it has divided the country more than it was previously, from an economic point of view and a social point of view. But also I think he would be very disappointed with the way in which the policing issue has frayed, because as Tim said, it's interesting, the type of conversation he had with me time and time again was, you will not solve the Northern Ireland issue until you solve policing. And unfortunately what we've seen in the recent past, because of the difficult situation that different circumstances that have been thrown up against the PSNI, where they obviously are having grave difficulty policing in a divided society, policing in an impartial way in a divided society. I think it's regrettable that we don't have somebody of the stature of Seamus Mallon present, and I say that with due respect to the people involved. But we have lost great statesmen in John Hume and Seamus Mallon. And I'm not just saying that because this is an SDLP organisation. Seamus, no more than anyone else, was extremely disappointed with, and he foresaw, as Enda has said, to a certain extent the demise of the SDLP, or the falling of the SDLP, as to a certain extent we saw it, Fianna Fáil, in that, you know, we tried to get people to come off the path of violence. And Seamus knew and foresaw the difficult road ahead for SDLP and people who supported SDLP, and also, in fairness to him, the Unionist Party. So I would think he would be more despondent now than he was shortly after the Good Friday Agreement, with the way in which things have evolved.
Right, and I mean, it's 4 years, I think, since he wrote that book, and you can't say that things have improved since then. Ian Marshall, somebody who is a neighbour of Seamus, and again, who brings a unionist perspective to this, I mean, can you see a way through the stalemate, or a way back from it, or a way out of it at the present time?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. You know, the one thing that I remember vividly about Seamus Mallon was he said things as they were. There was no back door. It was black and white. He told you to your face. He knew you might not like what he was going to say, but he always said it as he was. I'm not sure that he'd be as despondent as we think today, because he would see that the political establishments are in turmoil. And that's a phenomena here in London and in the US and right around the globe. But I think when he would look at the younger generation of people coming on who aren't blighted with, or don't carry the unconscious bias that we all probably carry, I think he'd be heartened, because there's a whole generation of people coming on who are positive, who are looking to the future, and I think he would recognise that. And it's interesting because in 2018, when Queen's held the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and remember, world leaders were flown in from all over to attend that, and the best speaker, in my opinion, that day was Seamus. Mm-hmm. And it coincided at the same time that I was elected to the Seanad, and I was in the process of writing a maiden speech. So I was coming out of Queen's one night, called in at the house, walked past the window, and Orla would know it. He was in the chair, watching Channel 4 News, reading the paper with the dog at his feet. There was the classic retired politician position, so it was. So he came to the
pipe.
Well, I forgot the pipe. But he came to the door and he said, "Come on in, what can I do for you?" Because I had first met him when I was president of the Farmers Union, and they were closing down all the wee country schools, and we worked together to try and save some of the wee small schools. So he said, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "Look, you spoke brilliantly in Queen's the other day, and I'd like to use one of your lines, with your permission, in my maiden speech." He says, "What was the line?" And I said, "Well, I don't know whether it's yours or whether you stole it from Heaney." Well, I got a look that would have cut me in two at the very thought of him stealing a line from Heaney. And he said, "What was the line?" And to this day, Sean, it's the most powerful line I think I've heard about this place. He says, "It doesn't matter what we call this land, as long as we all can call it home." And that encapsulates everything that we all understand about what we're living through. And he said, "No, Ian, I've thought long and hard about that. I'm writing my memoirs." And he says, I've thought long and hard about that line. And I says, "It really gets it." So when I look at him, and when I went back in a couple of years, and I see Tim has the book here, and I said to him, again, I went to the door and I says, "I want you to sign your book for me." And he goes, "What?" He says, "I don't sign many books." Well, I says, "You've signed a few fairly noteworthy documents in your time. Would you stick your name in the book?" So he put a lovely inscription in the front of the book, and he said, "Keep the good work up in the Seanad, keep opening doors and opening minds." And we all have a responsibility. And I think he would see now that despite the mess, the chaos that is in politics, that all the good people are still there. All the people who want to see peace and prosperity still are there. And I think Seamus would see through that and see the positives that we have.
Yeah, and Sharon, you are somebody who would describe Seamus as a mentor, because I think you stood for the council here in his and your home place, and as I said, became a mayor of Armagh. Would you share Ian's sense that there is positivity there, particularly among maybe younger generation?
My first memory, I suppose, of Seamus was whenever I was a young child. And I remember him coming to my granny Haughey's house. He was out canvassing. I don't know, maybe he was about 8 or 9 at the time. And my father had been out farming, and we were just coming down the path to my nanny's house, and Seamus's car pulled up, and out walked this tall man with great stature. I knew who he was as a child. My father was called Seamus too, but Seamus got out of the car and he says, "Well, Seamus, have you all the reading up done?" And I remember just being in complete awe that this man knew my daddy. And so the crack started, and they talked about everything, talked about farming, talked about football. And at the end of it, Seamus says, "Now, will you remember to come out to vote for me?" And by this stage, my granny was out too, and they were like, "Seamus, you don't have to come here." And that just stuck with me. As a young child, he was just someone that I was in awe of. And I just thought that he could relate to us. He knew what was going on in our family life, and he could chat about that. And yet, you would see him on the news, and he was talking to world leaders, and he was sorting out big political issues. And that was what made Seamus so very special. He was a man of the ordinary people. He could have been talking to presidents and Taoiseachs and prime ministers, but he just loved to be among his own people. And he always was true to his roots. And he liked being at home, and he liked being among his own people. I learned a lot from Seamus down through the years. He was a man of great peace and reconciliation. I think Enda touched on it there. You could talk about Seamus's traits, and my God, a man of such talent and skills. But one of his skills was listening. Politicians are often good talkers, but Seamus actually listened to people, and he could feel people's emotions and feel people's pain, and he took a lot of that on board. And I often thought over the years, those big broad shoulders of his, they carried so much weight. He carried the weight of the wrongs of the nationalist community, the things that were done to our unionist neighbours.
And also the weight of things that were perpetrated in the name of the nationalist
Exactly,
community that caused and heaped huge amounts of pain on people of the unionist tradition.
And he carried those pains from both sides of the community, but he carried it with a sense of hope and a sense of determination that those troubles had to end and that we had to find a peaceful way forward.
Orla, in the book he talks, and I only noticed this on second reading last night, if you like, or at least it sank, your dad talked about how occasionally things just would get to him, and he referred to, I think he borrowed that phrase of Churchill about the black dog, and, you know, I'm wondering how yourself and your mum Gertrude would have gone about just prizing him out of that and getting him going again.
We had no influence on prizing him out of that. There, all we just, I suppose, me as a child, I brought, you know, a different dynamic, different likeness, and he was to me a dad, and, you know, played with me, and he would arrive home and like he would be down and whatnot, but I would want to play tennis or I'd want to go out, and he would, you know, he would do those things with me. But there were certainly, looking back now, I see that what he used to do, we had two old neighbours, two elderly ladies, Anna and Mary Hamlety, and we would go for a walk round to Anna and Mary's, and he would just sit there, and the two of them would just talk, and he would say nothing, and he'd get his cup of tea, and then, you know, and then we would leave and we would come back home, and he would get something out of that, just a reform or release, just being with people that weren't talking about politics, and he wasn't have to think about anything like that. And they knew him so well, they would know that Seamus may not speak, but this was part of the therapy for Seamus, was come visit them and just be back among his community, and just listen to things like that. So, he was great in so many ways, you know, especially when it came to holidays and things like that. He would be totally switched on until you went on holidays, and you would have RTE on, you had a Radio Ulster, etc., etc. And then you would go on holidays, and he would switch off, and then the minute you got in the car to come home, RTE would be back on, Radio Ulster, and there would be no chat, and he would be back into mode.
Well, he had that great place of refuge that we both know about.
Absolutely. He had that boat hole in Donegal.
In Donegal. Tim, you were very close to Seamus, I think, particularly towards the end of his life, but all through your own career and his. I think I used the word to you before, by way of kind of an observation, kind of a consigliere to him, insofar as, you know, he needed advice. But you're somebody as well who's spoken and written about the architecture and the importance of the architecture of what was constructed in 1998. And I'm wondering, do you think it is sufficient or equal to the challenge that's there now? Because I saw, almost to my astonishment, today, the Irish News, they pulled out that old phrase of Richard Rose, was it, a professor of politics, famous in the 70s and 80s, the problem is there is no solution.
Good evening, Sean. Thank you very much. You always, as like Orla said, easy questions. I just want to say, first of all, thanks to the Hume Foundation, by the way, for, I think this is a very special evening, and I want to acknowledge Tim and also some of the board here, and send a greeting to Sean Farn, the chair, you know, who's, and I know Alex is here, his father-in-law, who's been a great soldier for all of this, and their board members here, Mike and others, because I think the notion that the Hume Foundation, you know, honouring Seamus is very apt, because Hume and Mallon, you know, they were like, you know, they were two brothers that we were all very fortunate to have in our midst through what we've had to chart over the last 40 or 50 years. And I also want to just personally, it's wonderful to share a stage with everybody here, and in particularly Orla, if I can, because you're asking about the lights of Seamus's life, and one of them is sitting here on my left, and there's another one sitting in the front row there, if you want to know what lights up Seamus, and it's Princess Lara, because that's actually, he got such joy out of the arrival of Lara into his life, and Mark. So, and it was just for me, just one personal comment, because I'm getting older as well. Like, it's such an honour as a public servant, and I'm with apologies, my former boss, and Dermot, and also I have a couple of colleagues, Lawrence Sims and Hilary Riley in the audit. For us as civil servants, for me to get the chance as a civil servant from Limerick, to get to know this, as Sharon says, this giant of a man, and he took me under his wing when I was only a young fella, and in the late 1980s, and he was already a giant. And I suppose it's the privilege. One of the privileges of my life was to work, starting together professionally, and then becoming friends. So I had the privilege of actually seeing. That meant, though, of course, Sean, that you had to be prepared to take the. You had to take the smacks as well. So representing KathleenNewHooligan.com, to Seamus from time to time, government policy, sorry guys, Taoiseach and Dermot, they weren't easy moments. And I can remember one day Seamus saying to me, Timothy, I don't know how you can look yourself in the mirror. Now, that wasn't a great day in my career, I can tell you, because he wasn't joking. So I suppose, and there's one other thing I want to say, Sean, on the night that's in it, because we're marking Seamus and then it'll be over and we'll be gone again. This is culture night all over the island. And so I think it's very appropriate because Seamus was part of his impact was that he was a man of the theatre. He was a man of presence, as you said, Sharon. He was a man of the word. He was a man. And of course, we all know, in 1962, he directed a play in Artlawn that won the All-Ireland Drama Festival, Our Town. So I think part of Seamus's was his ability with the word and his ability to communicate and his command of a room. That if he walked in here tonight, we were in presence. So you asked me about the architecture, and I thought, thank you, Ian, for what you said there about the home place, because I was privileged to be with Seamus as he was devising the idea of the book. And Orla, I hope it's okay if I say that after, sadly, your mom passed away, that was the moment for him in 2016 at the age of 80 where he said, I want to do the book and you have to help me. Now just think about it, folks. A man at the age of 80 decides, I'm going to take on doing a book. That's a big deal. And what kind of a book was he going to write? And the answer is, it has to be the book of my life. It has to be my last will and testament. And that book is A Shared Home Place. So we need to pay attention as to what this man decided were his closing words to us. So, and this isn't nice. There's nothing nice pie, please, now about what Seamus wrote here. So he wasn't talking about victory for a narrative that says Northern Ireland is British. He wasn't talking about victory for a narrative that says Northern Ireland is Irish, and that's it. And he was saying, actually, as Ian so eloquently said, I don't care what we call this place as long as we call it home. And so you asked me, Sean, what's the message from today? I think he would be, and I also salute the politicians and the young next generation politicians there and others here, because that's what would give Seamus his, it would give him his lift.
I'm just asking you, Tim, is the architecture of the Good Friday Agreement, is it up to the various and different challenges that are there now?
Yes, two answers. First of all, and it's in the book, first of all, Seamus himself had a great line. It said, it's for each generation to write its own history. That's a key insight. It's for each generation. So you cannot be hidebound by, with all due respect, the parents and grandparents. You have to take that and respect the roots of that. But each generation must write its own history. So that's part of it. And the second piece is, and he was very strong on this, and it's architecture, the validation and review section of the Good Friday Agreement. It is actually built into the Good Friday Agreement that there can be reviews where there are difficulties, and in other words, it's not cast in stone. So that was written in by the negotiators specifically to able to, and Seamus uses that as part of, and I want to make one other comment about architecture, Sean, please, while I have the mic. That is that he, there's been a lot of talk about Seamus and 50% plus one and all of that. And it's, let's be blunt, it's controversial, what he said there. But talking about 50% plus one is missing the point of what Seamus was getting at. The key point he's trying to make is we don't want history repeating itself. So, and so the key here is how do we find a way that we can share this place together? Because it's not about victory for one or the other, it's about to be able to share it. And that's the core, that's what has to be the focus. And then how that gets done is a matter, that's a technical issue. So I just want to nail that point.
Yes, and that's very interesting. It brings us very neatly, and thank you for that, Tim, to really, I suppose, what's at the core of Seamus's thinking, certainly in his latter years, this idea that the concept of parallel consent as installed or instituted in the Good Friday Agreement be applied to the long-term future of the island. That, in other words, it wasn't, as you say, or as he said, sufficient to be thinking in terms of a 50% plus one, even though that legally is the formula that would be there, but that you needed to have either a majority of both unionists and nationalists or a weighted majority of 60%, including 40% of each community. And how you measure that is another story, and he acknowledges that, maybe saying you could borrow from the primary elections in the United States, in the presidential election. But I'm wondering, Sharon, did he get a little bit ahead of the SDLP with that? I mean, how do you assess or how do you view that idea that he put forward in the book?
Well, I think Seamus, being the headmaster that he was, always challenged us. And even whenever he agreed with you, he would always challenge you to look at things from different points of view. And that was what made him a good politician, because he could see, the other side of the story. And I think in this recommendation, Seamus has challenged a lot of us. He certainly challenged myself, because I wouldn't be supportive of this. And I regret that I never had the opportunity to talk to Seamus about this in more detail. But I think he has detailed very well in his book his reasonings behind it, and he's very right in his reasons. We do have to look at what is going to happen after a referendum and what happens before the referendum as well. So, firstly, we have to acknowledge that unionists feel threatened by all this talk about a referendum. And when it comes up in the media, it's, when's it going to happen? Is it going to happen in your lifetime? Is it going to happen in 10 years' time? And there just seems to be an obsession of when the referendum is going to happen. The conversation needs to move away from that. It needs to move away till what is a referendum going to look like? What will the dialogue be beforehand? Seamus talks in detail about civic dialogue, so that the whole community on both sides of the border are involved in that conversation of what a new Ireland will look like, so that it is a truly shared place, that people can be respected, that cultures can be respected. We also need to consider, and the Irish government are going to have to at some stage consider publicly how will Northern Ireland be ruled in a new Ireland. And that there will be many different models and many different recommendations brought to the table. Seamus in his book was very forthright, and I think he started that conversation. He has started the conversation about, let's learn from our past, so that the wrongs of our past, the tables just aren't turned in a new Ireland. Let's ensure all those who are campaigning for a new Ireland, that we campaign to get as good of result as possible, because the weaker the result, there will be issues afterwards. And I think that's the lesson that I certainly pick up from Seamus's recommendation.
And just to come back to you, what is your view of that proposal, that idea that Seamus floated in the book?
Well, first of all, Sean, I don't accept that there isn't an answer to the problem.
We're going back to Richard Rose now. The problem is there's no solution.
Right. He says the problem is I disagree with that. If you look at what happened after the War of Independence in the Civil War in the Republic and the atrocities that were committed and that happened, the answer to the problem is time, understanding and example. Now, Seamus Mallon, wherever his spirit is tonight, is probably with the rest of everybody else in this country when the Irish rugby team take on South Africa tomorrow. And that's the Ireland that he wants, where everybody is united with a common cause and take out the box when they meet. I'll give another example. Rory McIlroy's foundation provided substantial monies to buy a site down at the back of Ashford Castle, in my own place, to build a second Daisy Lodge, which is a place for families to go who have a child who's going to die of terminal cancer shortly. And it gives them an opportunity to have a legacy of happiness and all of that. That's an Ireland that Seamus Mallon would support. That's the Ireland that Rory Best the former captain of the Ireland rugby team, has walked twice from Newcastle to Ashford and from Dublin to Galway, raising money for that same thing. So Richard might have his view, but I disagree with it. The problem can be solved. Now, was Seamus Mallon right or wrong in his 50+1 comment? In the Early House Convention and the New Ireland Forum, the matter of what would need to happen, as Sharon has been talking about, was discussed on various levels: federal Ireland, confederal, assembly, regional, what you do with your currency, your legal system, your education system, where your parliament would sit, how many, there are 10 years work on all of that. So those who assume a facile answer to a question, be it by 50+1 or 55-45 or 60-40, fail to understand the depth of what's going on here. Now, I sat down in Seamus Mallon's house. He was looking out in the armchair in the corner, and I was sitting on the couch looking out the window, and we discussed terror. I said in the beginning that history and geography determine, characteristics and personalities of people. And Seamus Mallon drove back home on many occasions at the dead of night, having attended another funeral of an atrocity. And I didn't really catch what the depth of his meaning, Sean, until I met a woman down in the south of Ireland myself, because I had an engagement with the Catholic Church over sexual abuse. And she said to me, it's very difficult for you to understand any of this. And I said, why is that? She said, you don't know what terror is, do you? Now, I remember when I was 12, we came around Northern Ireland in a caravan, travellers. We were parked outside Armagh on a lay-by. And a crowd came down the road and they started shouting, "Attack the caravan." So there was my father and mother and I think 3 or 4 of our children. But nothing happened. But I remember being scared out of my wits with all this noise. But the woman said to me down in County Cork, she said, "I'll tell you what terror is." She said, "Terror is when you're asleep behind your curtain in your dormitory and you hear those footsteps coming down the corridor and they stop outside your door at 12 o'clock at night and you're 13 years of age." And she said, you have to live with that for the rest of your life. And Seamus Mallon told me of examples of atrocities that had happened in Northern Ireland where the families have had to live for the rest of their lives with that. Now, I brought down the King's Mill people down to Dublin to government buildings. Some of them had never been to Dublin before. I spent 5 hours talking to them. And Mr. Black, who was the sole survivor of that atrocity, said, "We were made get out of the Volkswagen van, put your hands up on the roof," and the order was given by somebody in balaclava with a camouflage, "Do it now," having sent away 3 Catholics. And they were all shot, and he had 17 bullets in his back. And he said he saw the boot of the man who shot him, putting the barrel of the gun to the head of everybody else and blowing them into oblivion. He said, "I don't know why I was left. They thought I was dead." But he said, we have to live with that. So how do you erase that memory? How do you erase that rage and that hatred? And that takes time and understanding and example. And I don't believe that Seamus Mallon would concede defeat in any of this, because his voice was one of experience, honed in that brutal period of Irish politics. And there's always, a brighter day will come. But it's got to be, was his comment right or wrong? Who knows? It's for a different generation to write their history. But I know that if you put all your business on having a border poll, that's the end of it. It's not.
I know, but just on that idea of making preparations, Dermot Ahern, and Seamus as well, he refers to the idea of maybe using the citizens' assembly model to just look at various things and, how things might be integrated or dealt with. But I wonder, is it the case that maybe Sinn Féin are making the running on this, and the other parties are in the starting stalls. I mean, even just today, you had their health spokesperson saying that he wanted to put forward this idea of how there could be a unified NHS on the island of Ireland. I mean, isn't that the kind of thinking that needs to be nurtured, and we need perhaps to see more of it?
But that's what we did over the last number of years, the whole concept of an all-island economy. I was Minister for Communications and Energy at different stages, and one of the things that we kept on about was, like, it made no sense to have two electricity markets on either side of a border on a tiny island. It made no sense that in one part of my house, when mobile phones came, I was welcomed to the Republic, and when I went down the far side of the house, I was welcomed to the UK service. And indeed, to this day, if you stand on the pier in Clogher Head, which is about 20 miles south of the border, you're welcomed to the UK. That's one of the reasons why we pushed as a government the deletion or the implementation of roaming charges, free roaming charges, across not just the island of Ireland but Europe, and thankfully Brexit didn't interfere with that. But all of those things, it's nothing to do with Sinn Féin or the health policy.
But they're making themselves maybe a bit more visible.
It's all about what the Good Friday Agreement, and I think this is one thing that Seamus was trying to get at, and I was never a fan of 50% plus one. I was elected in 1987. My maiden speech, which to a certain extent went against the flow at that time in my party, which was talking in favour of the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I did say that I wasn't in favour. Well, it's not that I wasn't in favour of 50% plus one, but I recognised that you couldn't have 1 million unionists on the island of Ireland forced into United Ireland just on the dint of 50% plus one. You had to make preparations beforehand, and you also had to lay the groundwork for how we would live together on the island. As John Hume many times said, it's not about uniting the territory, it's about uniting the people on the island. And that's one of the reasons why our government and Enda's government, as successive governments in the Republic, have tried to push the whole issue of cross-border bodies, which unfortunately under the Good Friday Agreement have more or less fallen fallow as far as I can see. It's one of the things that, in the Republic we voted to delete elements of our Articles 2 and 3 of our Constitution in exchange for 6 cross-border bodies which aren't working, as I said, as they should be and as we thought they would be. But equally so, an awful lot of work has been done in marrying the different systems on both sides of the border so that we could show that there is the benefit of working together on the island, park the political and constitutional issues as was laid down in the Good Friday Agreement. They will occur in time, but we do need to do an awful lot more work in unifying our systems north and south, but a lot of work has to be done in
but there's
the,
a lot of
the
Ulster
north.
says no still.
Of course, and it will take generations, and it will take another generation, not just those young people who are at their debs down below. Unfortunately, because as we all know, that if you scratch the surface in this society across the border, a couple of miles from where I live, it's a completely different world, because there are so many people hurt. Despite what we read in our papers this week, that a sizable proportion of people in the south were affected by the Troubles. The reality is, and I know it as someone who's born and bred only a stone's throw from the border, those people who lived on the south side of the border had a totally different view to some of my Fianna Fáil colleagues who lived in Kerry and Cork about a united Ireland, because we were like Seamus Mallon. We knew the practical realities of what implications a united Ireland had for the future relations on the island of Ireland if we were going to impose a united Ireland on 1 million unionists against our will. It would in effect be transferring the oppressed minority of nationalists in the north to an oppressed minority of unionists in a united Ireland. And you needed to lay the groundwork before, and indeed an awful lot of work afterwards, in order to show unionists, particularly people who espouse to be British, that we can live together and that we can deal with the political and constitutional issues after we deal with some of the more practical issues that affect us day in, day out. And unfortunately, Brexit was one of the greatest, I think, damages to the progress for uniting our island from an economic, cultural and societal point of view.
Yeah, Ian, I'm wondering what you made of Sam McBride, the political editor of the Belfast Telegraph, did an interview recently with Wallace Thompson. He was a founding DUP member where he acknowledged that some form of new Ireland is inevitable, and he said unionism is closing our eyes and pretending that there's no problem. Now, I'm wondering, a bit like Seamus Mallon, had he got a little bit ahead of his own tribe, perhaps, or what did you make of that comment or observation?
The first observation I'd make is that Sam McBride's a journalist. His business is to...
Nothing wrong with that, you know.
There's nothing wrong with that, but that's the business of selling stories and making headlines. So what I would say is, and what I've always said is that, and I said this in the Shannon, that the reality is in Northern Ireland, despite the conversation many people have about the hardliners, about the Ulster Says No Brigade, about extremes on both sides. I work in a university. For 6 years I've worked there. I've never, ever discussed unionism, loyalism, nationalism or republicanism in the university. I run a business with my son. Do you know what we never talk about? Protestants, Catholics, unionists, loyalists, nationalism. Doesn't come into. There's a fixation sometimes from outside the province that we live in this cauldron of sectarianism and bigotry and this group of people who are fixated on the constitutional question. And that's not the case. Sam McBride's story was interesting in a number of respects, because I've seen lots of people who have gone through a journey in their life, and at a certain point of their life there's a road to Damascus moment, and they make statements or comments that completely conflict with what they've said in their earlier life. I don't think that story was anything only a reflection on where some people are going in their heads. And it's interesting because when I look at there was a really interesting thing that I thought was very important that happened a couple of years ago when Michael D. Higgins was invited or whatever to come to the Armagh church service. And that was probably more about a mishandled situation than anything else. But what it flagged up to me very much, and I saw this at my time in Dublin, is that unionists and loyalists have never actually understood the hurt that partition created across an island. They never really got the feeling of an island divided and separated and ripped apart. And the converse of that is that, for that matter, I don't believe that nationalists and Republicans have ever really understood the psyche of unionists and loyalists and the connection to Britain and the monarchy and their Britishness. And I think when we look at that this talk at the minute about referenda and a border poll is much too premature, because ultimately the thing that will drive unity will be for our children to see something where they'll be healthier, wealthier and better off. It'll not be about the flag they live under or where their seat of government is. It's about, am I going to be wealthier and am I going to be better off? I think when we talk about a border poll, the difficulty I have is that no one still can tell me what we do with the losing side the day after. There's 49% of people are going to be aggrieved. And whether it's irrelevant actually which side it is. But based on that, we've got to, first of all, as was said, I think it was Enda Dermot said, we've got to unite the people. And we're getting there. Because we are light years ahead of where we were 25 years ago. And I think that if we have just take a bit of time, step back, build relationships across an island. And remember, I was asked to speak in the Féile in West Belfast a couple of weeks ago, and the topic they gave me was, can a case be made for the union? Now, that's a hard gig to do at the Féile. But there's an interesting point, because actually, when you look at the relationship between two islands, there's 6.5 million people in GB define themselves as Irish or of Irish descent. There's actually more people in England that are Irish than there are in Ireland that are Irish. So, but it's the synergy between and across an island and between the two islands is critically important. And there'll come a time when we're already breaking down barriers, we're having good conversations, we're getting there. So the Wallace Thompson story, it's one man, it's an opinion. Everybody in this room has opinions. We all probably have different opinions. So I wouldn't
But it's not the kind of thing you would have expected from him 5, 10, 20 years ago, or even 10 days ago, necessarily.
On probably, I would say there's an analogy here, because there was a leader in unionism and a man who formed the Democratic Unionist Party who had a big change of heart in later life compared to his earlier days. So I would say it's not, there has been precedent.
Tim, I mentioned, and you said as well, you quoted Seamus in the book as saying it's for each generation to write its own history. And another thing he says in the book is that violence loves a vacuum. Now, arguably there's a vacuum there now. You're part of this international monitoring group, which kind of keeps an eye on, I suppose, people at the fringes. What's your assessment? Because you and senior colleagues and people with a lot of experience are meeting with people who, to borrow a phrase, swim close to the bottom of the pool. What's your assessment?
Okay, so I'm the Irish Government representative on the IRC, the Independent Reporting Commission on Paramilitarism. So there's 4 of us. Yeah, we do an annual report on the state of play of paramilitarism. And and that came about after, I think, Enda was Taoiseach at the time, the Fresh Start Agreement in 2015. Because, unfortunately, the gun is a part of our history, and something that Seamus was very strong about, and quoting his father, Orla's grandfather, Lara's great-grandfather, that it's about words, not guns. Guns solve nothing. But that, the gun has been absolutely a part of our politics for hundreds of years. And we have to face the reality that I worked for a state whose founding document, the proclamation, is actually a charter for armed struggle. And so we all have to accept and deal with the fact of that's our reality in this island. And Seamus's whole piece, because I want to bring it back to what Seamus would say, is that in fact that cannot be part of the future. And of course, the reason why he wrote this book at the age of 80 and said these words is because he fears that the gun is the potential of the return of the gun to politics.
So can you give reassurance?
Is not ruled out. No, but come on, we have to challenge each other here, folks. Come on. What Seamus is saying to us, this is about generosity. There's a quote here, he says, I would therefore appeal to a virtue sadly absent from British Irish, Unionist Nationalist, Protestant Catholic relations on this island, generosity. So my word back to anybody, with all due respect, talking about border polls and preparing and getting ready and all of that, is that generosity? Is that being driven through the door of generosity and through the door of accommodation? Seamus was very concerned about all of this later in life. He could have just satisfied himself with, just putting down the odd bet on a horse here and there, which he was not impartial to. But no, he chose to this. So there's a very important message, Sean, to all of us. And it bothers me a little bit as an old guy myself. I think we need to be careful about all the, I think a huge amount of the preparatory work is not yet done. We're just at the start. And I think if we follow Seamus has given us the compass points, which is, as Enda says, history and geography have dictated, where our reality. And we have 2 different worldviews sitting cheek by jowl, as you said, in a very small space. The only way forward is actually through accommodation. There's a quote I saw recently in a book from Gusty Spence, who apparently at one point said, there's only 3 options: mass annihilation, mass evacuation, or mass accommodation. And Seamus Mallon was a man for mass accommodation. Let's keep that at the forefront of everything we do, and let's be driven by generosity. That's the test of every conversation you're having, okay? And this is a challenge for every single one of you.
Close to the bottom of the pool, those people you're engaging with.
Exactly.
How do you read their state of mind and their attitude?
Deeply embedded in our history, and we have to respect that reality. I presume there isn't anybody sitting in this room tonight that would pick up a gun and walk out and go down a few streets and put a gun to somebody's head and pull the trigger. But there are people in our society who do, and that's part of history.
The David Irvines and others who represented politically that brand or that strand of loyalism, as it was called, they're not around today, are they? Or they're not influential?
Well, I would think on the basis of conversations we're having, I would be hopeful that there's still enough of a recognition among leadership figures in the groups that actually recognise that, you know, that the future is actually through democratic political means. And we're talking about what we call transition, you know, transition to an exclusively peaceful. But some people would say it's a bit late, isn't it, 25 years on? Well, that's the reality, that it's still there, but we have to keep working on it. But I think it's Seamus Mallon's, you know, signposting that is actually has to give us the best chance, which is accommodation and generosity.
I want to read just a shlucht, an extract from Seamus's book, just about diplomacy and political activity, and get a quick comment from Enda and Dermot and anybody else as well, because I'm just conscious of time. He says, at the moment, the political class in the Republic is not geared up to begin the vital debate needed before we even contemplate a border poll. Back in the 70s, 80s and 90s in Dublin, there was a constant and urgent debate in political, civil service, diplomatic and media circles about the North and how to push forward greater Irish-British cooperation based on the unity by consent principle to resolve its deep problems of violence and division. The outcomes were Sunningdale, the Anglo-Irish Agreement and the Good Friday Agreement. We don't have people doing that today. The generation of brilliant diplomats and senior civil servants who negotiated those internationally admired agreements is long gone. Political leaders and their advisors in Dublin and, of course, in London are now consumed by the existential threat of Brexit. The level of debate about the North in Dáil Éireann is woeful. There is little of the intellectual engagement and planning for future action on the island of Ireland that took place in the past decades. Until Brexit is dealt with, there is little appetite, for example, for the difficult business of pressurising Sinn Féin and the DUP to go back into a new Northern executive. Dermot, you go.
I can relate a story when Gordon Brown took over as British Prime Minister. Bertie Ahern was extremely worried about the changeover in that he had to rebuild a relationship with the British Prime Minister. He had a great relationship with Tony Blair. We attended one of those British-Irish Council meetings somewhere in the UK, and Gordon Brown took Bertie and myself into a cubbyhole at the back of the stage, and he said to us in very blunt terms, he had just taken over about 2 weeks earlier as Prime Minister, and he said, as far as I am concerned and my government, the Northern Ireland issue is solved. I am now going to put my focus on the security threat on mainland UK, as he called it, and he said that he told us that there were over 2,500 homegrown suicide bombers. He had just got a briefing from his security services, and that's where his attention was going to be put. And I have to say, in the intervening years, the eye has been taken off the ball by the British government in relation to what Ian and others have talked about, the necessity to work out the workings of the sentiments that were expressed in the Good Friday Agreement. I've often said that the Good Friday Agreement was only as good as the paper was written on, unless and until the people of the North particularly, but also the Republic and the UK, work out what were the sentiments that were in that Good Friday Agreement. And it comes back to what Ian said, to make the future generations see the benefit of working together as a community on the island in conjunction with our neighbours across the water. But as I said earlier, unfortunately, I don't like harping on about it, Brexit has put that back, unfortunately.
I meant to give you two further examples, Sean. In 1986, when the Canary Wharf bomb went off, I was Minister for Tourism at the time, and the second biggest tourism fair in the world in Earl's Court was due to take place shortly afterwards. And Baroness Denton, God rest her, was dealing with the tourism element for Northern Ireland at the time. And for years before this, there were two separate stands at the Earl's Court tourism fair. There was the Northern Ireland Tourist Board, and there was Bord Fáilte. And the view was that we shouldn't have a stand there at all in that year. And my view was that it would be far better to amalgamate the two stands and put them under one stand, Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, and that's what they did. And for the first time in years, you could see the pride in people's faces, saying, I am now working on behalf of the island of Ireland, and whether you land in Belfast or whether you land in Cork, you are a visitor to the island of Ireland. And the second example has slipped my mind for the moment. But Seamus Mallon believed, as I said, in constitutional nationalism by peaceful and democratic means. He was one of the few people, and it was a very good appointment, Dermot, by Charles Haughey to put him in the Senate, because when he did speak in the Senate, it's a rare occurrence with respect to all of those august minds in the Irish Senate that people would come in to hear what a senator is actually saying.
And they came in to hear Seamus Mallon
because
wanted to abolish the place.
They came in to hear Seamus Mallon because he had something to say of substance with leadership qualities. And I think that it was also part of his personality that he was a good storyteller because, as you say, he listened to what happened. And he exemplified that over in the House of Commons because he loved the cut and thrust of politics in the Commons. Others didn't. And you see, because he had the old tip on the horse now and again, he had also the little bet given to Speaker Weatherspoon. And you can't speak in the Commons unless you catch the Speaker's eye. And any time that Seamus Mallon wanted to make a point, he always caught the Speaker's eye. And maybe there had been a little tip or a news about a tip passed in the week beforehand. So he was an actor. He was well able to command himself, and he loved, taking the barbs but giving them back again. So in that sense, like while he may have dealt with the black dog occasionally, I also believe that with his aging and with his experience, that he'd be able to give to the younger generation of the SDLP all of the wherewithal to carry it on. And I might just, if I might just say this, I actually went through, taking an aging party that was on the floor down at 15 or 16%. Took 10 years up and down the country trying to put a bit of fire in their bellies to actually compete against your party and others. And that's what happened. Okay, different circumstances, I know.
And you had to
the same applies here now. Like the younger generation of SDLP people should not be afraid to carry, the banner that Seamus Mallon espoused for years. And his character as a young man was formed by what was happening around him. And he listened to that, he understood it, he articulated it. And that book you have in your hand, Tim, holds his challenge, which he set out there when he said that governments in Britain abused the nationalist population in Ireland, and in later years they treated the Unionist Party very shabbily. I actually think that what Prime Minister Johnson did in respect of Northern Ireland was an absolute disgrace, in absolutely neglecting what was an essential component of all of our lives and all of our politics, which is what I dealt with at the European Council, the last meeting I was at, when I said, and Prime Minister May was there, and there was a unanimous support for the fact that if the Good Friday Agreement were ever triggered, and if it were carried both parts of the island on the same day, that Northern Ireland, having been a member of the European Union as part of the Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, could rejoin the European Union seamlessly without having to reapply. And at the moment, in the current Brexit agreement, obviously free and unfettered access to the British market, free and unfettered access to the European market, makes it, from an economic perspective, one of the best locations in which to cite business anywhere in the European Union at the moment.
And to end perhaps on another positive note, Tim referred to Seamus's, I suppose, the fact that he took so much joy in seeing your daughter Laura, I think it is Lara. How confident, hopeful or otherwise are you for her generation as they grow to adulthood in this shared home place?
Well, extremely hopeful. When I consider Lara and people that I have worked with, they have no knowledge of what we lived through during the Troubles, and they only know a peaceful Ireland and a peaceful Northern Ireland, and that's what Dad worked all his life for. And I do think he and everyone else, I think they did deliver on that, and I think that's going to endure, and that's what's going to see us through. It's a quagmire at the moment, but we will get through, and it will have to get through, because what we have now is so much better than what we had in the past.
Okay, on that note, can I thank this panel? Ian Marshall, Tim O'Connor, Sharon Haughey, Orla Mallon, Enda Kenny and Dermot Ahern. Our second panel, I'm delighted to be joined by Fergus O'Dowd, Fine Gael TD for the Louth constituency since 2002. Also, he was chair of the Committee on the Implementation of the Good Friday Agreement in September 2020. I don't know how busy you have been on that now, Fergus, but in any event, Senator Niall Blaney is on the Agricultural panel in Shanadairn since April 2020, a member of independent Fianna Fáil until he joined Fianna Fáil in 2006, was TD for Donegal North East from 2002 to 2011. Justin McNulty, MLA, former Gaelic football manager, former player at senior level for the Armagh County team, All-Ireland medal winner, 2002, yes. Not the only one in the family either. Your brother and my good friend Enda was there as well, Mark and Gooch Cooper. You've been in the Northern Ireland Assembly since 2016 as MLA for Newry and Armagh. And Mike Nesbitt, broadcaster supreme turned politician, and serving as Strangford MLA since 2011, topping the poll in 2016, chairing the Board of Governors of Movilla High School, and also a member of the Irish Suicide Awareness Group, also a member of the Police Authority in Northern Ireland. Mike, I think it might be good to start with yourself. Policing, I think, as we said earlier, maybe overly politely, has become a little bit frayed at the edges between the very, very unfortunate leak, or not leak, but issuance under Freedom of Information legislation of personal details of 10,000 people, names, addresses, and causing a lot of problems. Also, the loss or the departure of the chief constable, and maybe an easing off of the number of Catholics who want to join the police service. So what's your, as a member of the policing board, give us an overall summary of how you read it.
Well, my concern is with the functionality, the effectiveness and the efficiency of the policing board. It has 19 members, 10 politicians, 9 independents. That is a lot of people. So when you're trying to hold the police to account, it can be very problematic. So to give you one example, there was a major problem, and the Chief Constable agreed, and the Policing Board accepted his offer of coming to the Policing Board for a 1-hour private session. The Chief Constable spoke for 5 minutes. He handed to one of his assistants, who spoke for 15. That left 40 minutes with 19 people wanting to ask questions. Do the math. That is not holding the Chief Constable and the Police Service of Northern Ireland to account. So my concern is, how do we make ourselves more effective in the job that we are tasked to do? It surprised me that members of the board, particularly independents, were blissfully unaware until the last moment that there had been a catastrophic breakdown in relationships at the top of the PSNI, that there were other issues in terms of the quality of information that was flowing from the PSNI to the policing board. And when I say quality, that is a euphemism for the accuracy and veracity of that information. And I have several examples of where what we were told was actually not correct. So we have asked the Department of Justice to initiate an independent review of ourselves. We are also looking to review the senior executive team of the PSNI, because clearly when relationships break down, we need to know about it and we need to do something about it. But underlying all that, you have issues like we no longer have 50-50 recruitment. You have the dissident Republicans who are targeting members of the Catholic nationalist community who are joining the police service in an effort to put them off. So there are real fundamental problems, because from 1998, it's a fair argument to say that policing was, as it were, the poster boy of the agreement. That was the big success, and you can't say that we're going in the right direction with policing today.
But still, Justin, would you say that generally there is a level of community acceptance still there for the Police Service of Northern Ireland that just wasn't there across the board prior to 1998?
Certainly there is an acceptance that the police service are there and play an important role in society, but in terms of my community, I don't know anybody in the police, and that's not a representative police force, and that's the sad fallout of tepid support for policing by one of the major power blocks in the north here for almost a generation. Cloak and dagger support for policing, I would describe it, and it's getting to a dangerous place, in fact, in terms of the lack of faith and belief in the policing system, which needs to be addressed and addressed promptly. And I feel the only way that can be addressed is if we show some leadership and return to the Assembly and start working together for the greater good and embracing that spirit of Mehel, which Seamus will certainly have been behind. But before I do leave that issue, I do want to leave that issue briefly, Sean, and say quickly, my father spoke very passionately. He's been a driving force in my life on a political front and on a sporting front, and it is actually 21 years to the day today since we were blessed to take home the Sam Maguire.
Well, happy 21st. I think that...
But also, I want to pay a tribute to your first panel, Sean, and to your comparing of that, because I was looking around at the audience, and everybody was completely intensely focused on what was being said. It was extraordinary. For over an hour of talking, the contributions from the people on the panel was extraordinary, extraordinarily positive, extraordinarily memorable, but real serious stuff which you couldn't argue with any of the points made from anybody.
Just while we're digressing into Gaelic football, okay, I think I formed the opinion many years ago that there can be no greater sense of honour or pride for an Irish parent than to see one's son marching around behind the Artane band on All-Ireland final day, be it in hurling or football. And Joe had the honour of seeing not one but two sons. I remember thinking vicariously, I saw Liam Hayes leading the Meath team around. I think it was, they didn't win, I think they were against Cork in 88 or 89, whichever it was. But thinking it was a great honour for journalism. It was about the most noble thing I'd ever seen a journalist do, was lead his team around. But sorry, that's just, by the way, Joe, congratulations. Happy anniversary. The boy's done well. Oh, God, no, you're not getting the microphone back now. You can tell us in the bar. You can tell us in the bar afterwards. But to come back to where we were earlier, about what Seamus Mallon might say and might do, and there's no second guessing him. But I'm wondering... and somebody suggested to me that if Seamus Mallon was in this room tonight, Fergus O'Dowd, would he be telling the Irish government in his own inimitable, blunt way that it must refer the London government's amnesty bill to Strasbourg?
Absolutely he would. And I think my committee, that's the Oireachtas Joint Committee on the Good Friday Agreement, we've suggested that and supported that some months ago. We've gone to the UK Parliament, we've met with Minister Kane, Lord Kane, I think is his official title. We've met with the British Ambassador. We've gone to the Americans. We've been to the United States. As a committee, I know we don't get any headlines. We're not looking for them. We're looking for action. So yes, we would absolutely support.
Do you think it will happen? Do you think the government will take that step? I think it has to happen,
because there's no party in the north supports what's happening. None from any quarter. And we've met, our committee, we've met with families from all sides who've been bereaved. And it's absolutely unacceptable that criminals who have committed evil and awful acts, no matter how long ago, can get off scot-free. And I think that's what it's about. It's about holding them accountable. It's not that they're going to spend eons in jail. They're not. But families are entitled to know what happened, who did what, and they're entitled to have the evidence that is there presented in court, and also to have the coroner's inquest. I think Seamus Mallon would fight for
Niall
that.
Blaney, that new law that became official this week, got, I think, royal assent was how they phrase it. It ends all civil cases and inquests arising from the troubles. But the Secretary of State, or as Brian Finney refers to them always as the Pro-Consul, Mr. Heaton Harris, he said they should use, people in Northern Ireland should give a chance to the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery. There are some people of integrity and repute working with that. What's your view?
It's fair to say that one of the clauses introduced in the House of Lords precludes it coming into law until May next year, but we'll never find it coming around. I think what has happened here has been one of the most reckless acts by one of the signatories of the Good Friday Agreement since the Good Friday Agreement. Completely reckless. This is the one issue that unites every party in this island. I don't know anybody that was against the action. It was reckless. It was, I suppose, in bills like this, the relatives and those that are suffering should be to the front and forward of any such legislation. That hasn't happened. It is actually re-traumatising families right across Northern Ireland, border counties and beyond. So I agree with Fergus. I sit in the Good Friday Agreement with Fergus. I'm spokesperson in Northern Ireland. I spend a lot of time in Northern Ireland talking to parties from all sides and communities. I know the pain and hurt that legislation is causing. I have no doubt if Seamus Mallon was around today, he'd be biting at the bit in relation to what has happened here. And as of last week, having spoke to Niall Martin in relation to this, I've been a strong advocate that we take a case as soon as, and sometimes I can be impatient, but his strong sense was that when we do this, we have to do it right. So we have to have the proper legal investigation of how we do it, and that's ongoing, and hopefully the outcome will be positive, and we intend taking the case.
Mike, did the policing authority, the policing board, did it have an input into this? And again, I'm going to keep asking you to put on your reporting or your journalist hat as well. Why do you think they were so determined to push it through against the face of all the opposition, the consensus that was there?
I think it's pressure from their MPs, and it's pressure from the veterans of the armed services in Great Britain. And it's got nothing to do with the situation in Northern Ireland. And I want to say this because I also spent a couple of years as a victims commissioner. Victims aren't stupid. They know that at this remove, the chances of a conviction for the person who hurt them and their loved one are incredibly remote. I don't know if it's 1 million to 1 or 5 million to 1. But there was a guy called John Proctor who in the very early 1980s went to visit his wife and newborn son in the Mid-Ulster Hospital. And he was shot dead in the car park. A man was convicted of that murder 32 years later. I am not going to look a victim or survivor of the conflict in the eye and say, I deny you the hope of being the next Proctor family. That is immoral, it's unjust, it is just wrong.
I think that case featured in the BBC series, isn't it? The Once Upon a Time in... So, is that the case that featured in that BBC documentary series? Was it Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland?
I haven't brought myself to watch it because I found it very difficult, but I believe that Proctor family were featured.
I saw that. It was an extraordinary piece of television, and it was so vivid and graphic all of these years later.
So at a Chatham House meeting, so I can't name this person, but I will say he was and is a member of the UK Cabinet. And I said to him, could you look in the eye one of your own constituents who had lost their partner to murder and say, I deny you the right to justice? And his response was, Northern Ireland's different. Murder's murder.
To go back, Fergus O'Dowd, to the conversation we were having with our first panel about, Irish unity, referendums or referenda and so forth. I happen to be having lunch today with two very experienced journalistic colleagues, one of them Vincent Brown, who reported from Northern Ireland for the Irish Press and the Independent many years ago, like from the start of the Troubles, was there on Bloody Sunday, gave evidence to the Savile Tribunal and so forth. But another was an RTE colleague, I won't name because I'm going to quote him, but he was again there in the 1960s and beyond, and became a very senior executive in the organisation. He just said, look, he said, I don't think that people, or that many people in this state, as in the Irish state, are that pushed about Irish unity. And there's really no appetite for it. And they certainly don't want those fellas with their lambeg drums kind of parading around these parts. We were in Dunleary, as it happens. Actually, if there was one place you could get people with lambeg drums, it would probably be Dunleary, given that they gave a great welcome to Queen Victoria back in the day. But what is your sense? I mean, do you think there's a hunger for unity, or how do you read it?
I think there is. Yeah, I think there is. I live in County Louth. Obviously, it's a border county. But young people, I'm talking about people 16, 17, 18 that I talk to, they talk about it as if it was a fact. And it's amazing the influence media and I think other political parties have on this debate. And I think it's very real, and I can feel it when I talk to people. I know that that's a huge issue. And as somebody who obviously a member of Fine Gael, I believe we have to tackle that in terms of where we're going, how do we do it, what are the options, who can we work with, all those issues come in. But I think at the end of the day, I think when the Northern Executive is not functioning, isn't working, clearly has failed, the North-South bodies are not working. So young people are saying, look, what the hell is going on here? You know, in the Good Friday Agreement, there is obviously clearly in the future to be a vote, a referendum. And they believe that that should happen sooner than later. I believe it should happen when we're ready to have it, but it is going to happen. And that's why I think our committee, and again, Neil will agree with me in this, we're meeting all of the academics, all of the people who work on the economics, all of the people who work on all of the background issues to tease out what would a new island look like. I'm not talking about necessarily a united political under one flag. I think Seamus Mallon is very clear on that he's talking about, you know, we have to find a relationship, a new one, that unionists and nationalists can believe in, a flag that both can support and give their loyalty to. So you can't force people into, obviously nationalists were forced into Northern Ireland. They didn't have a choice. They will have a choice in a referendum, but the problem will have to be that it must be attractive to them, and the one vote won't do it, even if it does it legally. And that's part of the problem. And if you have a referendum that has a very small majority for or against, it'll cause untold trouble and havoc. So I think it's incumbent upon us, and I think in fairness to Micheál Martin, he started off the Shared Island Unit. He's looking at under funding through that and meeting communities in Northern Ireland all the time, every week, talking about, you know, what do you want, what do you need, what's best for everybody. I know it's a long-winded answer to you, Sean, but I think we're taking the right steps. And the last point I'll make, the committee that I chair, the Good Friday Committee, is unique and special. It's the only Dáil committee where members of the British Parliament elected in Northern Ireland come to. And there are 18 MPs, 10 of them come to our meetings, believe it or not. And the good benefit of COVID, the only one that I can think of, is that you have Zoom meetings. So at every one of our meetings we have the Alliance, Stephen Farry, we have the SDLP, Claire Hanna, and we have obviously Sinn Féin. Now we'd love to have the Unionists. So we're trying to find a way, we found a way, Sean, finally, to do that by working with the British Northern Ireland Affairs Committee. We've met with them a number of times, and we're trying to find a common ground of topics that we can work on jointly. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the background.
Mike, when, if ever, well, I suppose when, would you envisage the Assembly starting to function again and leading on then to the election of a Speaker and the functioning of the Executive?
Well, I would like to think on Monday, because I think it is entirely misguided of the DUP not to allow the Assembly to function. But as I reflect on 25 years since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, it seems to me that at every critical turn, the DUP have made the wrong call. So in 1998, they opposed the agreement. 2016, they promoted Brexit around the whole of the United Kingdom when, as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, it took me about 2 milliseconds to decide that Brexit would be an utter disaster for Northern Ireland and would be unionism's greatest own goal in 100 years. When they held the balance of power, surprisingly, after that Westminster election, did they demand legislation which would cement Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom? No, they said, give us a bung, give us £1 billion. And now, at a time when Republicans have a narrative that says Northern Ireland is a failed, ungovernable statelet, what do the DUP do? Sing their tune. And so it goes.
So where do you see it all leading?
I have become very pessimistic. Coming out of the summer, I thought we will get back before Halloween. Now, I don't think it's beyond the bounds of possibility that Stormont's gone for good, because the DUP have just mishandled it so badly. And for admirers of Four Weddings and a Funeral, if anybody remembers that movie, I will now offer you 4 ironies and a paradox. And the first irony is that the biggest obstacle to constitutional change for people like me in my lifetime was the IRA, because their bombs and bullets represented an attempt at coercion. The second irony is that the group that has put the constitutional question back on the agenda is the DUP, not least through their support of Brexit. The third irony is unionists don't realise that the people who understand best that nobody's ready for a border poll are people like Enda Kenny and Micheál Martin. And the fourth irony is unionists have looked over our shoulders for centuries. The big threat to our position in the union is Irish nationalists. You barely make the podium today behind the Scots and the English nationalists. And the paradox is, any sensible unionist or loyalist looking at Brexit for lessons to learn ahead of a border poll will say, do not go to the people until you've thought through what change might mean to the nth degree. And not just pensions and the NHS, but is that postbox outside your window still red, or is it now green? And if it's green, do you give a damn? You've got to think all that through. But paradoxically, those same people will look at me and engaging in a debate, even in a debate like this, and say, you're a bloody Lundy, you're a traitor, you're a Judas. And my view is, and I'm probably very much in a minority within unionism here, well, first of all, we say we're not going to engage in a debate with nationalism because nationalism has a predetermined outcome of constitutional change. And yet we want nationalists to engage in a debate with us when we have a predetermined outcome, which is the status quo. My view is change is inevitable. When it comes, I don't know. And what shape it takes, I do not know. But the least likely outcomes are the status quo and the traditional 32-county single sovereign state. We're not going back to 1801 and the Acts of Union, and we're not going to 1916 either. But let's get together and form the relationships where we can manage that change to the best effect for everybody.
And I suppose that's a good cue for you, Justin, to just address that question posed by Seamus Mallon in his memoir. How do we ensure that a future united Ireland is a peaceful, agreed Ireland?
I think certainly not by poking unionism in the eye with United Ireland, which seems to be the raison d'etre of a big political bloc right now. I think we have to pitch United Ireland as a win-win, not as a victory for us and a defeat for them. Extol the merits of United Ireland from both perspectives. And I was recently in Donegal town. I was just reflecting. I was in a beautiful Church of Ireland church, which is very well upkept in Donegal town. And I was reflecting on the unionists in the south. And where do they sit in relation to the discussion on United Ireland? What's their viewpoint? And how have their lives evolved since partition, where they felt they were left behind? My grandfather on our side was in the 4th Northern. He felt he was left behind, but he recognised that the majority of people in the north were of a unionist persuasion, and he was reconciled to that and knew when it was time to lay down the guns. So I think it's very much around discussion, Sean, of win-win, and interrogate every issue that may be of contention, but from a win-win perspective. What's best for this land as a whole, this place we called home, as Seamus referenced?
Yeah, Niall, just on the question of the timing of the referendum, I mean, Leo Varadkar, was criticised by the Secretary of State for saying he expects United Ireland in his lifetime, but there's every possibility he'll be around in another 50 years because, he minds himself. So that mightn't be a great boast. I'm not sure about the rest of us here. Who knows? But, people are starting to think about about dates. Bertie Ahern says maybe the 30th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement will be the time. That's 2028. I think the SDLP leader was talking about 2027. I mean, like, do you think it's helpful to be trying to put a ring on the calendar?
I think it's very unhelpful to put the ring on the calendar. I suppose if you look at what we're discussing here tonight, Seamus and Seamus's book, and I suppose he led with this in that caption that's on the screen there ahead of you, the shared home place. He has led the model that Neil Martin came in with in 2020, the shared island unit. And what the shared island unit is about, and as someone that comes from Donegal, I know it too well, because as a young politician, I remember the first National Development Plan coming down south, and Northern Ireland was viewed as a blank. And because of that, the likes of the N2A5 didn't happen. Now, Dermot and Bertie Ahern moved it on with Tony Blair. It should be built by now. We'll not go into that tonight. But, you know, if we want to achieve this, it's a bit like Patrick Healy said to Tommy Tiernan one night. You know, people want to sing rebel songs about United Ireland, but they won't not sing them to achieve it. So that's where the focus needs to be. If we want to achieve, we have to do the work. But forget about the date. I've said this to Sinn Féin, I've said this to Ireland's Future. Sinn Féin and Ireland's Future really want to unite Ireland. Start working with unionists. One of the first questions I asked the Ireland's Future group, how many unionist communities have you gone into and discussed what their problems are? Not one, and they still haven't done it. So the more we talk it up, a date to United Ireland, the further down the road it's going. Let's not fool ourselves. So the shared island unit is about looking at all those departments that worked separately all over the decades to now bring it together to understand, and this is the work that's going on, the shared island unit. And apart from the billion that's there looking at the cross-border projects that wasn't done over the year, the likes of Dermot's Narwater Bridge and the university work that's going on, collaboration and health and likewise. But to establish what does it really cost to run Northern Ireland versus the southern economy? What does policing look like and what does it cost? Why do people in Northern Ireland think so much of their health service, even though their outcomes for the likes of really serious things like health, like cancer care and coronary care, is not a good model? So these are the things that we need to establish. We need to establish where we're at before we sit down to talk about anything. And then when we talk, it's about the economy, stupid, as we heard so many times over the years. It's about moving things on Northern Ireland to ensure the next generations are looked about, that they have a life. And even from the unionist perspective, they need to know that they don't need to export, and it's an awful thing to say, that they're young people for an education, and by extension a life into the UK. That we have a model here that's security for them, education-wise and job-wise, and ensuring that everybody. And I suppose the one thing that's missed here, Sean, that over the last number of years, in particular the last election, the middle ground is building very, very fast. And I think that's what's really going to dictate where this island goes from here. Because while you have two parties at each other's neck at the minute, I think quietly behind the scenes they're in a bit of turmoil. Because a lot of what they're doing is built on populism, not policy. But the more that middle island grows, the opportunity becomes for their parties to achieve what we all want, and that's prosperity for the whole island, and build it on policy to ensure we all have a future.
Fergus, and maybe others might like to come in on this one. It struck me just thinking ahead to this evening's event, and Niall just reminded me of it by his mention of Patrick Healy, that Patrick Healy's arrival in that seat in the Late Late Show studio could be a very positive and useful thing, a development, in the sense that we might be able to see and not turn off conversations that are really important. And he would be in a very good position, based on his own experience of his half a century on this earth. What do you think?
No, absolutely. I think he's a key person, because that's a huge show, and I think almost 800, I think 1 million people actually, 800,000.
That was last week.
Oh, last week, sorry. This is the second week I can't see it. We had to figure out thinking last week. But the main thing I think is that change is coming. there should be, the First Minister of Northern Ireland should be Michelle O'Neill. She's the person who's been elected to that. Some unionist parties don't accept that. And if you have a political change in the South, and I'm being very honest, you could have a Sinn Féin Taoiseach or a Sinn Féin Foreign Minister or whatever. So that will create its own momentum. And I think, as somebody who does not agree with Sinn Féin, but I fully support, a new relationship on the Ireland, it's incumbent on us to come up with a method or a way with really thought through policies of where it'll go. I'll just give you one example. We had the national teachers in with us, our committee on last week, and the starting salary, they told us, for a teacher in Northern Ireland is 28,000. The starting salary for a teacher in the same primary school across the border is 41,000. So there's the thing. Now, I know that Ian Marsh was talking earlier about economic facts. Now, I never knew that was a fact. So there's huge benefits, economic, for us all to work together.
I think the pension isn't too bad down the south, relatively speaking.
No, it's much better actually. So I think, but I mean the economic. I think the south has got it right in the economics. I think our standard of living is higher than it was, and I think the problem with the north, I think, is that so many young people don't stay here. They go out, they've got degrees, and they go to England. They never come back. So we have to build a new island, and I think the northern economy, particularly Derry and Donegal and so on, we have to think in new ways. And I think, Sean, and I won't go on too long, but I really think we can make significant progress if we're practical, if we're realistic. But we must remember the reality is there, that there will be a vote, and we've got to get ready for it. And the only way we'll win that if we can persuade unionism to come with us. And they'll only do it if they can give their loyalty to a new relationship, north and south, that we can live with on both sides.
One thing that was reported just during the week was that there's been a big drop in the number of students going from Northern Ireland to particularly the universities in Dublin. We've good ones in Galway and Cork as well, but there was a long tradition, particularly of, say, students going to Trinity, but for various reasons, not least because they've changed the admission qualifications and the weightings attached to A-levels and so forth. I mean, is that something should be done about? And you don't have to wait for the Assembly to be up and running for that to happen.
Yeah, I feel that's a retrograde step, really. My sister went to UCD, my brother went to Trinity, and now they've changed the admissions criteria whereby you must do 4 A-levels to qualify for access to Southern universities. I don't understand why that would be introduced. I think that's a dividing factor as opposed to a unifying factor, so I think it's something that should be rectified, and I'm sure Fergus can put all his energy into having that matter resolved. But I think it's just, why introduce barriers when you should be trying to iron out wrinkles?
And we had the benefit of Eamon Malley in Dublin for 4 years or whatever number that he spent on there in Trinity. So I said in jest. Okay, look, last thoughts for all of you. Mike, I was just wondering, I was referring to Wallace Thompson there in a previous discussion. Ian Marshall didn't attach a whole lot of weight. What did you think of somebody like a founder or member of the DUP saying, look, we've got to accept there's going to be a nice rally?
Yeah, it just makes me sigh. I mean, what was the last 50 years all about? You know, when you're going to turn round the way Paisley did and recognise that relationships are the only way to do it, that whatever about 100 years ago, nobody owns Northern Ireland anymore, and nobody's going away. So it would make sense to kind of learn to maybe muddle along together, and maybe if we do that, we might actually learn to actually enjoy each other's company. But Sean, if I may, because I haven't mentioned Seamus, and I came to love the man, just an inspiration to me. After a shaky start, because I used to present Good Morning Ulster on Radio Ulster. And I want to tell you the story. 2 minutes should do it. I went in one morning and they said, whatever the story was, the SDLP had put up Seamus Mallon. He'd be on the phone from London. And with Seamus being a kind of sparky character, I had this technique. It was a 3-question technique. First question was open, let him set out a stall. The second I called the nudge, where I tried to get him onto the ground where I thought he might be vulnerable. and the third was the punch when I'd go for him. And it kind of worked, except when I hit the punch, through the punch, he didn't react. And only time for one more go, and he didn't react. It ruined my day. In fact, I'm not the better of it now. The next day I go in, new production team, new stories, and I'm told the SDLP are putting up Seamus Mallon on the phone from London. And here I'm going to change one word. So with a tape playing and Seamus is live next, the producer comes into the studio, gives me a nudge, I take the headphones off, he says, look, I didn't hear yesterday's programme, so I don't know what happened between you and Seamus Mallon, and I don't want this to affect the way you conduct this interview, but you need to know, I've just got him on the phone, and he said, if that flipper tries to wind me up again today, and I asked him the open question, and he did me. And 2 Fridays later, I'm sitting in the Regency bar with my mate, and we're just finishing up when 2 pints of Guinness are put on the bar counter in front of us. And we said we didn't order those. And the barman pointed to the corner, and Seamus Mallon just lifted his glass.
Well, look, on that. Justin, your parting shot.
I'll just reflect on a conversation I had through Alex Attwood, actually, in terms of the New Ireland Commission, the SDLP's New Ireland Commission, and we were encouraged as elected reps and as party members to reach out to unionism to see where they were in terms of a way forward after the whole Brexit debacle. And the person I reached out to, well, one of the people I reached out to was a unionist called Alan Black, survivor of Kingsmill. I sat down with him in his house in Bestbrook, and I said, Alan, I want to talk to you about United Ireland. And he completely opened up, and the warmth and the engagement was phenomenal. He talked about his sister living in Castle Blaney and how he would talk to me about United Ireland all day long. But he says, see that other crowd? I don't want anything to do with their New Ireland. They're out there, United Ireland. I don't want anything to do with it. I'll talk to the SDLP about United Ireland all day long, but the other crowd, no way. Which reinforces a point and reinforces Seamus's messages throughout his life, which were speaking to unionism to come and build with us, as in the last line of his maiden speech in Westminster, come and build with us. And we are the party who have that capacity to encourage unionism to come and build this new Ireland with us. And there's a latent pool, a latent energy in the SDLP of people and families and past members, children, nephews, nieces, who are waiting, who are just, that latent energy, are waiting to come crashing down. And whilst we're in a bad place right now, electorally, I feel that latent energy is there waiting to explode, come crashing down like a mighty waterfall a la King's speech. And I think I'm positive about that. I'm incredibly positive, incredibly proud about the legacy of Seamus Mallon. He's the reason why I'm sitting on this stage this evening. I'm very proud that not one person can put their hands up and said Seamus Mallon did wrong by me or my family. And that's a very proud position to occupy.
It's a wonderful thing to be able to say. Great observation. Niall, I spent some time covering by-elections in your county in Donegal, and I would have seen your uncle Neil T on platforms and so forth. Would it be fair to say that you are maybe a moderate by comparison?
I suppose it would be fair to say that, all right, Sean. And I suppose, moreover, to just me, as coming from the independent fall stock, and I suppose what I would say to you, that whole Blaney era is seen in his terms, but it goes much beyond that to my grandfather's time, the founding of Fianna Fáil in 1926, when Sean Lamass came to my home place. So Fianna Fáil runs deep in the veins. That's the first thing I'd say. But second, I'd say in relation to Seamus Mallon, and a bit like Sharon was saying earlier, as a young guy growing up, you're just struck every time you heard Seamus Mallon and even John Hume speak. You would, a bit like tonight, you would sit back because you knew you were listening to wisdom, and you were always anxious to hear what they had to say. But moreover, and I don't think it's said enough, Seamus Mallon was someone that wasn't about himself. I think that really proved himself in the fact of the relationship he had with John Hume. Seamus Mallon was a very, very able politician, one of the most able ever to walk out of Northern Ireland. But he never seen himself in that position where he needed to be ahead of John Hume or the leader That takes incredible wisdom from a politician, and it's lacking, sadly it's lacking today in politics, and moreover, in the work they done in encouraging unionism. You have to ask yourself, the days that Turnbull was really under pressure, what was keeping him in the room and who was keeping him in the room? And it was people like Seamus Mallon in his ear.
He said he locked the door. Stop him going out.
But there was much stronger relations there than people will ever know or talked about or written about. And I think politicians of tomorrow want to know how they can do good in their communities and become a good politician. Certainly Seamus Mallon's book is one to read, and to live by that legacy and that attribute he had, that it wasn't about himself, it was about his people and attaining peace and a successful future for the next generations.
Lovely.
Yeah, I'll just say that I met Seamus a number of times. My mother, Lordy Mercer, was a great fan of Seamus. She used to love what to be on the television, and she was a great admirer, a different generation to be, but she was really could see how fantastic a person he was. I live in a town called Drogheda. I was a member of the council when we gave him the freedom of the town. So I think the real thing is, what is the future? What is our shared future? And the only thing I'd say is that, if we look at different models in different countries, the Irish ambassador to Canada spoke at our committee about, the problems in Canada historically. And I think we need to look at a new way, where different communities that didn't get on work together. We have to find that solution. And the last point, if Jeffrey Donaldson doesn't step up to the mark, either we drift into a dreadful place altogether, or is it time to look again at the Good Friday Agreement? Could the government say, right, look, if the position of deputy isn't taken by the DUP, shouldn't the next largest party take it? If the majority in the Assembly can agree to work together to get a future and a plan and a policy platform, doesn't that make the most sense? And that's, I think I know there's lots of different views on that, but I think that's something we should consider.
Okay, for another day. Look, my thanks to you all for being with us. Fergus, Justin, Mike and Niall, and also our first panel. Look, it's been a really interesting and reflective evening, and I think Seamus, Enda referred to him earlier as wherever he is looking down on us. I think he would have been reasonably pleased. I think he would say, okay, pour me another one. They did okay. Thank you all, and good evening.
I'd just like to say on behalf of myself and my family, thank you all so much for attending this evening. A very special thanks to all the panellists for attending this evening. I'm so grateful, and the way that everyone has spoken so warmly and so fittingly, I think, in respect of my father, has been wonderful. Thanks to Sean for doing a wonderful job comparing it. You haven't lost your touch, Sean, and I suppose... if I was Patrick Keelty, I think I might be shaking in my shoes. Just finally, I'd like to thank the Hume Foundation for hosting this evening, and for Tim for everything that he's done and continues to do. I think this evening has been wonderful. I think it's been what Dad would have wanted. It's been a reflective evening, but it's also there have been lines of conversation and communication opened up, and I think it's a conversation that should continue, and it's the only way that we're going to go forward is by communicating and trying to find a way through this all. So thank you very much.